Welcome to SAT Interviews with your host, Farai Ian Mavuti. Now, with Russia's growing influence on the African continent, it's important for us to ask these questions. Is this a force for good or for bad? Now, to shed light on this, I sit down with the deputy head of the Russian embassy right here in the UK, Mr. Alexander Gusarov, who will provide insight on this particular narrative, if indeed it is a force for good or for bad. Tune in. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Gusarov. Now, of course, it's an incredible honor to have you here, given the very context of the timeframes we're in. But we want to focus on Africa and Russia relations. Now, there's been a lot of talk around the world with regards to Russia's emerging influence within Africa. And I just want you to sort of give us a sense of what the vision is from a be it trade, security, and partnership perspective. What is that looking like? What is that vision that Russia has for Africa?
All right. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Russia is indeed right now, in a way, returning to Africa, rekindling lost connections and tapping new opportunities. And you can see this, you can sense this by the frequency of the visits of high-ranking Russian officials to Africa and African countries. For example, my Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, has been to 20 African countries over the past 3 years. He has been to South Africa 3 times over the past 3 years. We are reopening or establishing new embassies and consulate generals across the region, roughly a dozen over the past 2 years. And just recently, a week ago, we've established a new department within the MFA of Russia to deal with partnership with Africa. So really this shows the level of our political, but also economic, I guess, investment into the region and our commitment to really try to consolidate the internal development of African civilization in this process.
Okay, well, given the fact that a lot of African countries are sort of shaping their own narratives in their future, how do you contribute to that? Of course, I hear you saying that you've launched a new department specifically focused on Africa within the context of foreign relations. Russian investment is less than 1%, well, at least at 1% in Africa. Do you see that growing? And how do you contribute to Africa's own story in terms of its vision of its own future?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, we've already had a department for Africa. In fact, there were 2 departments. One was dealing with Middle East and North Africa, and then one department was dealing with Sub-Saharan Africa, the entirety. Now there is a new department which is there for multilateral, basically, cooperation along the lines of the African Union and the different other regional groupings in the continent. So it's work in progress, you might say. I mean, look. Obviously, we are assessing Africa's rise in the nascent multipolar world order. This is a reality. I mean, with its growing population, with its treasure trove of natural resources, with its industrial and agricultural development, Africa really is the continent of the future, you might say. And we recognize this as a fact, and therefore we are doing our utmost to engage in demand-driven cooperation with African countries bilaterally, but also multilaterally. And as for the investment, of course, it's not there yet, but it's growing. It's taken us a while to come back from the post-Soviet stage to where we are now, and this process will be accelerating in the future, I'm sure.
Well, I like what you say, especially on the question of multipolarity, because Russia often promotes itself to be its actions to be distinct from sort of the global north in terms of Western powers when it comes to Africa, which tends to be agenda-driven. But how is Russia ensuring that, its own agendas are not going to equally influence the narrative of colonization, as it were, as we're seeing currently with narratives, surging from China, Africa relations, as we've seen in its common cause currently, that the narrative is such that people are conflating that. Africa tends to take a backseat to narratives and be sort of approached with in a paternal sense. How does Russia make sure that its own agenda does not conflict with, the agenda of multipolarity?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it would be surprising if Russia were to kind of drive the same narratives as those espoused by some of our Western colleagues who used to be metropoles vis-a-vis African countries. Russia does not have this experience. We have never had African colonies. We have never exploited Africa's wealth, including via multinationals or debt instruments, debt enslavement, as it were. So you've mentioned, repeated the word agenda. I mean, I wouldn't like to use the term agenda. It's a kind of a loaded term that has negative connotations. But if you speak about, you do deliberate, I know. But I would push back on you on this. Russia has a very keen interest, I should say, and it's a national interest, to make sure that in a multipolar world order, which I think even the Americans now seem to recognize is there, the Africans succeed collectively and individually, that they become more sovereign and more agile as actors in world affairs, that they move up the ladder of the international division of labor, that they are more sovereign in their actions, and Russia is willing to do its part to contribute to this outcome, most certainly.
Well, I get that. And you're sort of taking a more decolonial sort of approach to the thinking. But there are criticisms of your own decolonial sort of project as it pertains to Africa, for example, in areas such as, Central Asia and so forth, and Chechnya, for instance. The decolonial question is, well, you have been somewhat imperial. This is what critics will argue, that your actions have been somewhat imperial, be it Chechnya or Ukraine, and what denies us as Africans to then not be suspicious in terms of your growing influence within the continent itself?
Well, I mean, I'd like to leave aside the questions of Ukraine or Chechnya or other regions for the time being. I mean, these are totally different files and differently approached. Look, in Russia's modern history, let's put it the Soviet Union, right? Because this is the modern reality of the 20th century. Russia has not just aligned itself with decolonization efforts, but we've actually spearheaded and championed these efforts in many different ways. And since its inception, the young Soviet Republic was actively driving this decolonization process, contributing to the self-determination of African nations. We used to do this back in 20s and 30s of the 20th century, when the Soviet Republic was quite fledgling. And it especially moved forward after the Second World War. In 1960, the Soviet Union was the first country in the UN Security Council and the UNGA, the UN General Assembly, to promote the declaration on the granting of independence to colonial nations and peoples. And the UK and the US, by the way, abstained on this declaration. And subsequently, thousands of Soviet teachers, engineers, specialists of different kinds traveled to African continents, to the African continent to help accelerate this process of self-determination. They helped build schools, universities, hospitals, roads, infrastructure. And you mentioned Central Asia. These engineers came from all across the Soviet Union, from Ukraine, from Caucasus, from Central Asia, because all of these republics within the Soviet Union, just like Russia, they had the same legal status. There was no difference. And so I think, answering your question, there is no inherent contradiction between Russia's internal, what our philosopher Berdyaev used to call the blooming ethno-religious diversity, and our internationalism in support of Africa. They go hand in hand.
I see. Well, it's strange. You mentioned quite a number of the work, the inroads that were done historically, especially as it pertains to education, healthcare, and so forth, and which are part of Africa's current priorities. As you know, our numbers are not doing so well in terms of access to education and healthcare. And these are some of Africa's priorities independently. And given the fact that it's now high stakes with the introduction of Trump's administration, quite a number of aid is being withdrawn within that particular perspective. How does Russia support Africa within this sort of, it's protecting its own priorities within that context, as it were?
I think the most important thing is that when we meet with our African colleagues, we try to talk less and to listen more. And this is very important. This is the value that we assign to the multilateral formats that we've set up with Africans. You know, we have the Russia-Africa Summit. They have met twice already in 2019 and 2023. Mm-hmm. Last year, I think in November in Sochi, we held the Partnership Forum meeting at ministerial level between Russia and Africa. These are all formats for discussing these manifold avenues for cooperation, be it healthcare, education, telecommunications, even space research. Since you mentioned education in particular, let me say that we assign a high priority to this avenue. We have ramped up scholarship grants for African students. We are fine-tuning the system of vocational tuition and vocational guidance. We are opening up new linguistics courses within Russian universities, but also faculties of Russian universities and African universities. And if you compare, it's a very simple figure. At the time of the first Russia-Africa summit back in 2019, there were about 17,000 African students studying in Russia. Last year it was 35,000, so the number has doubled.
Has grown.
Yeah.
Well, and which is solid. But how about in terms of the intra aspect of it, the internal aspect of it, in terms of education investment? Tell me more about the space action you're taking in terms of the collaboration between the education sector with Russia and the African continent, in as far as space, for example.
I think in space, precisely in this area, this has to do more between the Russian scientific establishment and the space program that we have, and with the relevant African efforts on a national level. Mostly this is, as far as I understand, about bilateral exchanges on these topics. And we are also signing different agreements between Russia and specific African countries on collaboration in the area of space research. This is quite important.
Right, right. And also, I think of moving away from education and sort of the work that you've done in terms of the space aspect of it, my question is around security. Now, of course, part of the narratives around security have been quite controversial when it comes to Russia's performance in Africa. My thinking in terms of how I want to frame my question is, given the contributions you've done, especially in areas like Central Africa, how does Russia ensure that there's a balance between what we've currently discussed about your decolonial agenda, your the initiative of collaboration, and equally ensuring that there's a mutual sort of focused approach to African relations with security challenges? What exactly is Russia's motivation in terms of security? You guys are possibly the largest providers of weapons in Africa alone currently, but beyond that, you have provided you've taken quite a lot of considerable actions, be it in the Sahel and so forth, which has brought some level of stability. But my question is, what is really the motivation there, and how are you balancing the two aspects between the ideas you have and the aspirations you have in terms of the mutuality of the relationship, but at the same time within a security sense, can they be balanced?
I think they can be, and when countries attain their sovereignty, when they begin to stand on their own two feet, there is, of course, a certain level of vacuum of security. It's only natural, and some kind of security assistance is sometimes required. Russia, as you quite rightly mentioned, I'm not sure that we are the biggest weapons provider, but certainly Russia has the expertise and the assets to provide a level of security engagement.
You are the hardest.
That is demand-driven. After all, it is the African countries, and not only African countries, but across the world.
Right.
It is the countries themselves that define for themselves their requirements in terms of security assistance. Sure. And Russia can provide this on a bilateral basis officially. We have the military technical cooperation with these countries, and there's nothing wrong or nothing illegal about these efforts. This is a normal situation, cooperation between the ministries of defense. You've mentioned also private groups. I'm sure that they exist. These companies inevitably do. And from what we hear,
but also the impact of these private groups. I'm more questioning what has been the impact? What, in terms of your own reporting and so forth? What has been the impact of these private groups on the continent themselves? Have they been a force of good or bad?
Again, I would be hesitant to assess companies that provide their services on a private basis, on a commercial basis. The Russian state is not formally involved here, but frankly, what we've heard on the ground from the African countries that have required this assistance and have availed themselves of this assistance, we have heard mostly positive reports about the stabilizing influence that such efforts may have had. Of course, there is always criticism,
Yes.
but sometimes it seems to us that
Well, is it true? Is the criticism
I
true?
don't know. Again, it's up to the countries
to the
on the
local.
ground to decide for themselves.
Well, what are
But
your reports
sometimes,
telling you of that
sometimes it seems. I'm just want to say that sometimes this criticism seems to be emanating from countries that are, well, let's put it in a very vague form, part of the competition, and maybe if they're not doing so well, then they, of course, may have. Some motivation to criticize
So
others.
it's part of the industrial complex.
It's part of the game, I'd
And
say.
I get that, but I suppose at the end of the day, it's still real lives, and I'm wondering: is there a seriousness to how to the thinking around the participation of these private military groups?
In Russia, private military groups are invariably guided by our domestic legislation. Of course, Russia adheres to the international standards and the norms of international law in these respects.
Which is great, and I've noticed that, of course. I'm not sure if you're aware. There's some sort of a decolonial campaign around francophone states, in particular within the Sahel, and they seem to favor Russia over the French. Of course, obviously, historically, they would not favor the French. But why is Russia taking so much prominence?
I don't know, frankly. I wouldn't like to comment about.
What does your engagement say?
But again, I don't think it would be premature for me to comment on this. If the countries themselves on the ground see some form of preference in terms of moving away from some suppliers to others, that is their decision, their sovereign decisions. We don't intervene in these decisions. And of course, nature abhors a vacuum, as they say. So if somebody leaves, somebody comes in. It's only natural. But this is a very delicate point, maybe, which of course. And again, you probably know more about this than I do, sitting here in London.
I doubt that, Deputy Ambassador. I doubt that. I mean, Deputy Head of the Embassy. I doubt that. But if I may go into an area of where I know you'll have a lot of expertise on, is sort of and a lot of African nations have been arguing against sort of like the lack of reform in multilateral institutions globally, especially institutions such as the UN. And we've seen such a, if anything, after the Gaza impact, more so, especially when it came to the questions around Ukraine and Russia, we saw a heavier sort of approach to the Russian question than we did see with Gaza. But and a lot of African nations are wondering, isn't it time to reform the UN? And of course, they've made those agitations. A lot of the country I was born in, former President Robert Gabriel Mugabe, often used to argue this particular case in the public forum. What is Russia? How does Russia collaborate with Africa to ensure that particular aspect, especially within the Security Council, given the fact that Biden had literally offered the African nations pittance by virtue of giving us a seat at the table, but not a voting seat? I'm curious to see how Russia can support that particular endeavor for us to have an equal footing on the UN Security Council.
Okay, well, first of all, I certainly admit and recognize your words about double standards existing in the treatment of various conflict situations around the world. Gaza and Ukraine are quite depictive in this respect. As for the United Nations in particular, Russia, as you know, is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. In this capacity, we are coordinating quite closely with African colleagues. We obviously respect and we proceed from coordinating with Africans on the basis of positions that are adopted in a consolidated fashion by the African Union and usually represented at the UN Security Council by one of the non-permanent African UN Security Council members. So this is work in progress. We are coordinating at the UN on a plethora of issues where, frankly, Russia's position is more often than not closer to the stance adopted by countries of the global south, including Africa. As for the representation of Africa within international and regional multilateral bodies, we are certainly supportive of these endeavors. We are supportive of this ambition, including as regards the UN Security Council. Now, of course, again, this is a work in progress. Nothing has been resolved so far, and there are different ideas on the table. As for the African nations, you know that their position is based on the Ezulwini consensus and the CIRT declarations,
Right.
and these are positions that we respect and that we recognize, most certainly.
Well, so hopefully, maybe as time goes on, we may be able to see that. But
Hopefully, yes, I'm sure.
yeah, we remain optimistic. Now, moving on to an issue that is more germane to the current elements of narratives in as far as the public media is concerned. As you're aware, Russia and Ukraine have been strong leaders in terms of supply of wheat, sunflower, and so forth, right? Which is a critical resource for a number of African countries, especially Egypt, South Sudan, and Nigeria, of course, which has impacted in terms of food price points and the entire food chain in terms of logistics and so forth. My question around that is, Russia, of course, granted that there is of course the differences between Ukraine and so forth, but it has impacted African supply chains. I'm curious to see what Russia has. I know that Russia has taken quite a number of actions by granting fertilizer and food stuff to countries like Sudan, Zimbabwe in particular, and I believe Nigeria, if I'm not mistaken. But in the long term, this has impacted, of course, Africa's supply chain. Food security has further deepened. Food insecurity in terms of the kind of Africa in terms of what it needs in terms of wheat production or wheat output. 60% of its supply is coming from Ukraine and Russia. Yeah. What are we looking? What does 2025 look like in terms of supply?
I mean, look, you're quite right. There was indeed a price hike in the commodities markets a couple of years back. It went up and then it went down. And the prices right now, as far as I understand, have stabilized, more or less.
Yeah.
But as regards the reasons for this price surge back at the time, I would frankly be doubtful that it had everything to do with the Ukraine crisis in particular. There were a number of systemic factors.
Okay.
The global pandemic, the COVID pandemic, when people started to shut down borders and basically, install these kind of protectionist measures.
Right.
The subsequent lax monetary policy, the pumping of liquidity into the capital markets, which of course raised inflation. Then at the same time, you had this forced push to a green energy transition. So these are actually the underlying factors. The Ukraine crisis may have played some role. It probably did, but not the conflict itself. We think not the military aspects of it, because both Russia and Ukraine continued to produce roughly the same amount of wheat, grain, and corn and fertilizers. So all these commodities that Africa in particular needs. But what certainly did cause an impact at the time, and this is where I'm leading probably, is that the largest role was played most likely by the Western restrictions, by the Western economic warfare against Russia that took place at the time, and that really impeded the proper and normal trade flows between Russia and other countries, not just Africa, by the way. There was a problem with everything, supplying agricultural infrastructure, spare parts, fuel, financial transfers, insurance of ships, freight handling, port logistics, you name it. So all the elements in these chains were affected by this in some ways. And at the same time, we saw that the Ukrainian grain, which was supposed to have been dispatched primarily to the most needy nations across the global south, in fact, only 3% of that grain ended up in the least developed countries, at least in line with this Istanbul package, the Istanbul grain mechanism. For the most part, the grain ended up in European ports. It was processed and then resupplied at higher price levels. So it was also a level of rerouting and manipulation, let's put it this way, of the markets. Well, it's a host of factors. So I think what this means for the future is that Russia and Africans together have to think for the future about really trying to immunize our bilateral and multilateral cooperation in this particular sphere from these harmful negative externalia from sanctions. We have to make our cooperation sanctions-proof in a way.
Okay, and quite interestingly, you say it that way. And I think you frame it quite well in the sense that that we need to somewhat come up with mechanisms to think around the issues around food security and so forth, which there are quite a number of measures that a lot of African countries are thinking about. And I'm curious to see in terms of be it Africa thinking about self-reliance and so forth, how do you contribute to that? Given the fact that you have the technologies when it comes to fertilizer production as well as wheat production.
I mean, look, again, coming back
Are there any technological sort of exchange?
There are lots of technologies. And first of all, just to come back to the previous question, Russia has done much. We have supplied absolutely, free of charge food products and fertilizer to some of the countries of the region, one thing. Over the past years and even decades, we have written off substantial chunks of African debt, something like $20 billion. The trade turnover between Russia and Africa has surpassed something like $25 billion, and it's growing quite dynamically. And if you look to the future, there are two strands of issues that we need to tackle together. First, of course, technology, you're quite right. Russia does have and is able to provide quite substantive technological advances, be it in the nuclear sphere, for example, small modular reactors, which everyone seems to be talking about these days. Russia has this potential, and it would certainly be useful to quenching African energy needs. Again, coming back to space research or telecommunications, which would be then free from being integrated into kind of Western systems.
But are there any practical programs you can point to within, for example, energy, utilizing just the reactor example you've given, that Russia is already making inroads with in terms of the continent itself?
Look, there are vast numbers of programs of bilateral cooperation with every single African country. I don't think it would be fair for me to point every single.
Yeah.
Of course. On energy, again, healthcare. We are doing much also in terms of medicine. You may remember that during the COVID pandemic, we supplied the Sputnik vaccines to African countries, and there is a big potential for building on that. But the second part of this, the second element of this equation, let's put it this way, is again making sure that our cooperation is immunized from outside interference, as it were, which does happen quite a lot nowadays. And this is being handled in a multilateral fashion between Russia and Africa in these formats that I've mentioned.
Right.
But it's also being discussed more globally within BRICS. And there are already 3 African countries that are part of BRICS. There are countries in Africa that are forming the outreach to BRICS that took part in the Kazan summit last year. And there are innovative ideas being deliberated there, like, for example, correspondent banking networks, setting up these linkages.
That has been a big challenge.
That's a big challenge. Or setting up alternative currency reserve arrangements, or some kind of digital mechanism for settlement mechanisms. So these are all issues that we need to address.
But I know that Russia develops some sort of payment system, alternative payment system. I'm curious I'm sure more insight will be shared, but how far are we gone with that particular project? Is this something complete? Is it something actually now working in partnership with other countries?
I think yes, it certainly is, because Russia is growing, our economy is growing. It couldn't grow without this outward projection of our trade influence, and this is happening.
Some would argue you just have a good governor.
We do. We're lucky in this respect. You're quite right. But it's also about forming tailor-made solutions to our bilateral cooperation with different countries around the world, not just with Africa, but with some of our main partners like China and India. Everything is being deliberated and made in a very tailor-fashioned way.
Well, speaking of partners around the world, recently we've seen the emergence of, the resurrection of Donald Trump as President of the United States. He's come back on the stage with a very a flurry sort of approach to his diplomatic angles, and he, of course, before winning the elections, he argued that, I'll come into Russia and within one day I will sort out the Ukraine and Russia issue. Of course, now it's past a few days now. I think past a few weeks.
A few weeks already, yeah.
Right, and we haven't seen the one-day impact. Are you optimistic about how Trump is approaching diplomacy compared to Biden?
I'll have to choose my words very carefully.
Please do.
It's been exactly
but I wish
just a couple of, but I will. Just a couple of weeks
sure.
Since the inauguration, and there have been a number of very interesting, colorful statements emanating from the White House since then. Every day seems to bring something new in this respect. I think it would be premature at this point to really speculate about whether these statements will be followed up by practical actions. In some respects they are, in some they aren't, and whether and how much of an effect this will have, not just on the style of U.S. foreign policy, but also on the substance and the strategy. As regards Ukraine in particular and the U.S., you're right. There were different statements being made, different projections about how long it will take to settle this issue. The United States, especially during the Biden era, has played a key destabilizing role in turning Ukraine from a once relatively prosperous and stable country into really an instrument of proxy warfare against Russia. If the U.S. feels that it has something to contribute at this point, obviously we are prepared to listen very carefully and to assess these proposals. Our embassies remain open. There are channels of communication. But most certainly this will not affect any changes as regards the objectives that Russia is pursuing as far as the special military operation is concerned. We are absolutely resolute in implementing these objectives in a military way or through a negotiated solution. And the same holds true for Africa. Our determination to elevate this partnership with Africa to a really strategic level is long-term. It's here to stay. And the fact that this new department that I've referred to was inaugurated right after the inauguration of Donald Trump actually is very indicative in this regard.
Well, and kudos to Minister Lavrov on that, I suppose, part of your department. Now, I suppose as a parting shot, thinking about areas such as climate change and technology, which I think you've covered quite extensively. Climate change is a big issue, given the fact that a number of African countries have had to deal with the bad impacts, the negative impacts of climate change. As you may know, quite a number of African countries are agro-based, and when it doesn't rain, it pours within our context, right? In the sense that it pours negativity, food insecurity, and impact on the economy. Russia has been, of course, a tremendous partner within the context of security, as you so rightly put out, and technological exchanges. How about in the area of climate change?
I think on climate change, as on many different international thematic issues, we are close partners with Africa and with African countries. And there is a greater potential to be unlocked here. We've already mentioned work at the UN level, which is ongoing. But there is really a large range of African regional and sub-regional organizations. You name it, COMESA, ECOWAS, SADC, IGAD. And there is a large potential for interaction between Russia and between organizations with Russian participation, like the Eurasian Economic Union, with these structures, with these entities. Africa is moving towards a pan-African continental FTA.
Yes, the Africa Free Trade.
Exactly, FTA. So we are, of course, keen to see linkages being installed between the Eurasian Economic Union and this free trade area. This would be, I think, also a good step forward in attaining the idea of a greater Eurasian partnership an idea proposed by my president, Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
And of course, coming to climate and to other issues, we are, of course, wholeheartedly supportive of South Africa's chairmanship right now in G20. We will do our utmost to help South Africa lead a very productive chairmanship in this format. And as I've mentioned, Africa is also very much part of BRICS now. And this is a very good and worthwhile format to coordinate as well on these issues.
Brilliantly put. I think especially when it comes to the G20 aspect, I think we can explore more. But given the fact that we don't have more time, lastly, here's my question around, how does Russia ensure that its collaboration with Africa remains of mutual respect, deepened by, of course, issues relating to shared values and goals?
I think our cultural affinity and our, let's put it this way, fraternity between Russia and Africa, it doesn't rely just on economy and politics. This is really a cultural factor. There are many things that are driving us together. And I think the level of respect that we have for African traditions, for African culture and languages, this is also one of those factors which is driving us forward together, hand in hand. We, on our part in Russia, we are doing what is necessary to accelerate this level of knowledge about Africa. African linguistics is being prioritized in Russian universities, like my own alma mater, the Moscow State Institute for International Relations,
right,
or the Russian Friendship University, also based in Moscow. We are attracting a wider range of African athletes for sports competitions. There are many more African exhibitions being held in Russia nowadays. So I think it is this cultural affinity that ultimately will be the decisive factor in progressively moving this relationship forward. And let me tell you, we are building for generations to come.
Well, with that said, thank you so much for your time,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Gusarov. I truly appreciate it. Guys, thank you for tuning in. SAT Interviews this week with your host, Farai Mavuti. I truly do thank you for joining. And for more insights, please do check out www.southernafricatimes.com.